Good afternoon, and welcome to the lecture series on the art and culture of the Renaissance. My name is Rich Colton. I'm the AP European History teacher at Eastern Regional High School in Voorhees, New Jersey. And on behalf of Jack Pesda and Camden County College, I want to thank everyone for taking part in this lecture series. This is the second one that I've done, and I know it's a lot of fun. And thank you for taking part in the journey. There are 49 of you signed up for this lecture series, and it would have been a lot of fun if we could have done this in person, but unfortunately, here we are. So this is my first experience with Canvas as a portal. It is not the first time that I've done remote education. As you know, all of the high schools in New Jersey and many of the high schools in America are doing some form of remote education, but this is the first time I'm doing remote education for adult learners. So I'll ask that you bear with me. So first, a little bit about the course. If you are logged on to Canvas, this is the screen that you'll see. What I will do is all of my lectures, all of my videos, I will post to YouTube, and you'll get a YouTube link in the modules. And then what I'm hoping we could do to facilitate some classroom discussion is talk in the discussion tab. So I will post weekly videos, and I will also post weekly discussions. Now, this is a lecture series. There's no homework. There are no grades. So if you don't wish to participate in the discussions or in the questions, that is completely okay. Don't feel like you have to. Don't feel compelled to. But I always find it's more enjoyable when it's a conversation that goes back and forth. And so I'm hoping we could use the discussion tab here in Canvas to make that happen. So, art and culture of the Renaissance. Let's go. As I said in my email, this is intended to be an introductory level course. So we'll start with the big question, and that's what is the Renaissance? And a good definition that I've found online is this. So it's an awakening of European art and culture after the crisis of the late Middle Ages. And there is just an awful lot to unpack there. So what are we talking about? When we say an awakening, what does that mean? When we look at the Renaissance in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, what do we really mean by awakening? Is this something that's brand new out of whole cloth? Did the painters and the literary masters of the Renaissance just start doing something new, or was it a reawakening? And by reawakening, meaning here we are in the 14th century, the 1300s, and are people discovering old texts and old styles of two-dimensional art or old styles of three-dimensional art, and are they applying that to their modern process? And let me suggest that it's probably a little bit of both. So when we talk about the Renaissance as a rebirth, maybe it's a reawakening, but maybe it's also something new completely. And what do we mean by the crisis of the late Middle Ages? Well, traditionally, history has looked at the fall of the Roman Empire as a crisis of civilization. So, think of the art and culture and music that flowered during from the 5th century BC all the way to the 5th century AD. And with the collapse of the Roman Empire, you have this age of barbarians, this Middle Age. Sometimes historians call it the Dark Ages. And I've also seen it pejoratively referred to as 1,000 years without a bath. That's probably not true either. But when we get to the 1300s, when we get to the 14th century, we have all these extreme crises that are taking place in Europe. So we have a period of extreme poverty and extreme famine, which also coincides with an explosion in the population. And those two things may sound like they conflict, but we'll show you how they don't. Civil war in a number of countries. So for those of you who are familiar with English history, we have the War of the Roses. For those of you who are more familiar with Italian history, we have the fight between the Ghibellines and the Guelphs, or the Ciompi revolt, if we're looking specifically at Florence. Or in France, we have the Jacquerie. But also a period of external conflict. So these burgeoning nation states are invading each other, and that's a period of great uncertainty and crisis. We could look at the 100 Years' War between England and France. And then the most important thing that we talk about when we talk about the crisis of the 14th century and the crisis of the late Middle Ages is, of course, the Black Death, the plague that takes place between 1347 and 1351 or 1352. And because of everything going on in America and the world right now, I thought it might be interesting for us to do a side-by-side comparison of what's going on in Florence vis-a-vis the plague and what's going on in America, because you're all now plague experts. Where does the term come from? When we talk about the Renaissance, how do we get that? I mean, is it possible that the people that were living and working in the 1300s and the 1400s knew that they were doing something new and fantastic? And the answer to that is yes, they did. They knew that they were doing something new and fantastic. We have a remarkable work by Giorgio Vasari called The Lives of the Artists. And he talks about some of the famous artists that you're undoubtedly familiar with, your Michelangelos. And in Lives of the Artists, he actually uses the Italian word for Renaissance. So the term has existed. The term comes to us from the 16th century, but it's a term that contemporaries used. His book was published in 1568. If you really want to understand the period from a historical perspective, a place that I can point to you to is Jacob Burckhardt. He was a Swiss historian, and he talked about the Renaissance as the triumph of the individual, like a time when European civilization looks at man and man's accomplishments and says, this is worthy. And if you want to trace a history of modern man and modern thought, this is the place that you start, the 1300s. A more modern historian and author, Sidney Alexander, referred to the Renaissance as dances over fire and water, which I think is a very elegant way to put it. And if we look at European civilization, there is this maybe conceit that all of Earth is made up of four substances, and I will add that when we look at the most important room in the Renaissance, which is the Tribune Gallery at the Uffizi, there are panels dedicated to all four of those elements. So a little bit of the historiography. If this is something that you are interested in, we can talk about it in the discussion panel. How did people come up with the idea of the Renaissance? I'm thinking that some of you may be here, or were brought to here, or were brought to this lecture series because of this fundamental question. First, what is the Renaissance? And then, where did the Renaissance start, and when did the Renaissance start? So a big question that we will attempt to answer in this course is, did the Renaissance begin in Italy? There was a fascinating documentary. It's either on Amazon Prime or Netflix. It's called The Renaissance Unchained. I encourage you to check it out. But the main thesis, or the central thesis of that lecture series, is the idea that the Renaissance really didn't begin in Italy. It actually began somewhere else. And the producers of the series travel all over Europe. They look at Flanders, they look at Germany, and eventually they go back to Italy. And their conclusion is, no, the Renaissance really didn't begin in Italy. So a question that we'll have to ask here is, did the Renaissance begin in Italy? It absolutely did. And we will be giving our Italian friends all due credit. So if you were to identify an epicenter, what is ground zero of the Renaissance? Flanders is great, and London is great, and Paris is wonderful. But you really want to go to one town. And you can probably tell me what that town is. What's the town? Of course, I said it in my email. It's Firenze. It's Florence. So you could draw you could sit in a 3-block area in and around Florence and be in the spot where the Renaissance began in the first half of the 14th century. Just like if you wanted to understand Impressionism, you know that you would go to Paris and Arles. Well, for the Renaissance, we're going to start in Florence. And if you've seen that documentary series and you want to make the argument that the Renaissance actually started somewhere else, I hope we can have that argument in the discussion thread. So, for me, as an educator, the easiest way to understand the Renaissance certainly is by looking at art and architecture, 3-dimensional art, 2-dimensional art, because art is a great mirror. It's a great mirror for culture. But what is culture? How do we understand the Renaissance as a change in culture? Well, this is something that we Americans really struggle with. So every American thinks that they're a cultural expert because we live in this land of great diversity. And when you ask undergraduate students and when you ask upper-level high school students to explain culture, invariably they start talking about the idea of diversity, and they start talking about things like, what people wear and what people eat and what holidays they celebrate. And that's all important parts of culture. But the heart of culture is, what do people value? What do people find important? There are a specific set of cultural values that we associate with the Renaissance. And we're going to see them shift from a Middle Age mindset to a new set of cultural values. And these cultural values still go a long way in defining humanity here in 2020. There's a number of specific cultural values that we'll look at, and they're all important. But if you were to boil down this cultural change that defines the Renaissance in one sentence, it would be this: we are moving from a God-centered world to a man-centered world. Now, that's not to say that God loses importance or religion loses importance. It doesn't. In fact, I would argue that through the 3 centuries that we associate with the Renaissance, God and religion are still the most important thing to people. But it's not the only thing. And all of a sudden, man and man's accomplishments become valuable. And we're going to see that in the art, and we're going to see that in the architecture, and we're going to see that in the literature. So, what are some of those specific cultural values? And as we go through this program, we're going to break some of these down a little bit. One, of course, is classicism. What's classicism? In the 14th century, you have all of these folks who have a renewed interest in what we call the classical period, or the age of antiquity. Things that were important to people in ancient Greece and ancient Rome during the Roman Republic become valuable again. So Renaissance writers like Petrarch rediscover the giant of the Roman Senate, Cicero. And all of a sudden, Cicero's writings take on a new value. And while they're discovering the writings of the ancients, they also discover the art of the ancients. So Roman architecture becomes more important. And Greek sculpture and Roman sculpture, Roman sculpture is simply an aping of Greek sculpture, become more important. And so the idea that things that happened 1,000 years ago, even though they happened before Christ, before Christianity, and they were considered outside of the aegis of the church, have a renewed value. There are things that we can learn from people 1,000 years ago. That's classicism, and we're going to see it everywhere. Another thing is skepticism. Like, this is one that we have to be careful about, because for a lot of modern students, skepticism, especially for teenagers, skepticism and cynicism are the same thing. But when people in the Renaissance talked about skepticism, it's having a questioning attitude about the world around them. Don't take things at face value. One of the great quotes that we see during the Renaissance is ad fontes. What does that mean? For those of you who don't speak Latin, ad fontes, to the sources. Don't accept that this thing that you're being told is true simply because somebody, like a king or the church, tells you it's true. Let's figure it out. One of the great Renaissance figures is a man by the name of Lorenzo della Valle. And he uses a careful examination of sources to disprove one of the most important documents in all of Catholic Church history, the donation of Constantine. We'll get there when we talk about Lorenzo Valle. Another cultural value is this idea of individualism. Like, man himself has dignity, and man himself has value, and the work of the individual and not the collective all of a sudden is important. And so that's reflected in a number of ways. One is the artist as celebrity. We know the names of people who produced great works of art during this period because they were important. The idea that to be a full person, one must be well-rounded. Our ideas today about things like nobility and what it means to be upper class or high class come directly from this period. So maybe we will look at Baldassare Castiglione's Book of the Courtier or Machiavelli's The Prince. All of these things can be summed up in one word. So in an earlier slide, I suggested that understanding the Renaissance as a shift in value can be summed up by saying we're moving from a God-centered paradigm to a man-centered paradigm. Well, if there's one word that we can kind of squeeze down and reduce the Renaissance to, it's this. It's humanism. The idea that human beings and their accomplishments and what they do on planet Earth has, in the words of Giovanni Pico, dignity, or simply a kind of utility. Human beings matter. There's a place for us, and there's a place for our accomplishments. The human body is a piece of art. The human body is artworthy in the same way that the Greeks and the Romans understood it. One word on Renaissance cultural values before we take a look at some of the other things that we'll be doing in this course. When people see words like humanism and secularism, like little buzzers go off in their heads, because we use those words in 2020, but we use them differently. So when I say moving from a God-centered world to a more secular world, I don't mean a world where religion doesn't matter. Religion absolutely matters to men and women in the 13th and 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. It does. So sometimes when we say secular today, we mean a sphere outside of religion, and that's simply not how we meant it 500 years ago. And sometimes secular and humanism are placed together. And in the 20th century, sometimes we talk about secular humanism, and that's not what the Renaissance man means. Religion and God is certainly very important to all these people, and that will be reflected in the art as well. If I were to ask you to write down a list of the 10 most important Renaissance artworks, I guarantee that half of them would be biblical in nature. All right. This is a time of great learning. So if you are interested, we can take a tour of some of the great universities in Renaissance Europe, and some of them even date back to the High Middle Ages. So, what was the first university in Europe? Can you tell me? Very good. It's the University of Bologna. But even before the Renaissance begins, we have collections of students. And they weren't physical places like we understand universities today. They were kind of like, well, actually, they're kind of like this. A group of people who want to learn something come together. And the body of students themselves form the university. So places like Oxford, Paris, Boulogne, your first universities. And what are they studying? Well, when we talk about scholasticism, we're talking about church learning. For those of you who are familiar with Thomas Aquinas or the great doctors of the church. When we talk about the liberal arts, this isn't the study of law or the study of scholasticism. This is the study of something else. Liberal arts in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century meant a study of the trivium and the quadrivium. What are they studying? Logic, grammar, rhetoric, very Greek. What's the quadrivium? Arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. And astronomy and astrology were actually considered very close. During this class, we'll look at architecture. We'll spend a lot of time in some of the great cities of Europe, taking a look at how, taking a look at some of the buildings that were designed and built during the Renaissance, and how those buildings reflect some of those values that I mentioned. Especially the classical influence on Renaissance buildings. You know, how did Italian architects look at buildings from ancient Greece and ancient Rome and use those architectural types to inform their new buildings? Some of them are going to be super interesting, and I hope that you'll enjoy that. Of course, you can't have a Renaissance art class without looking at some of the great works of two-dimensional art, some of the great paintings in history. So we'll look at some different techniques that are new during the Renaissance. We'll look at some things that Renaissance artists did to trick you. Why are Renaissance works of art so new from periods of art that came immediately before it? We'll look at some of the great masters like Da Vinci and Botticelli and Donatello, and hopefully we'll span the entire the entire range from the Gothic Renaissance, pre-Renaissance period. We'll look at Giotto all the way up to the very beginnings of the Baroque, up to Caravaggio. If you are interested, we can certainly look at some tapestries and crafts as well. I can take you to the island of Murano, so you don't have to go. But when we go and tour ancient Venice or Renaissance Venice, we'll spend some time with stained glass and glass making, because that can be a lot of fun. Here we have two pieces of bronze sculpture by Donatello. Oh, it's a bronze sculpture on the right. That's the equestrian statue of Gattamelata from Padua, using lost wax as a method. And Donatello is one of our great sculptors. And on the left there, that's that sculpture of David. We'll spend some time with David when we go to Florence. But that sculpture on the right, many historians consider the greatest work of art, greatest work of sculpture since the fall of the Roman Empire. So we go 1,000 years without being able to do something like that. And what are the Renaissance values that inform that work? Poetry is art, literature is art. We'll look at a couple of examples of each. One of the things that we associate with the Renaissance period is the use of the vernacular. So most works of art which precede the Renaissance period in Europe were written in the language of the church and the empire. Of course, that's Latin. All of a sudden, starting in the 13th century, we go back to the 1200s with Dante, people start creating works of art in their native language. And isn't that interesting? So we can look at, Dante's work, or Boccaccio's Decameron, or even Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. They are humanist in nature, meaning they combine the other values of the Renaissance, a natural skepticism. We're going to see that in the work of Erasmus of Rotterdam, for example. And many of them are classical in nature, but also with a sense of religion. So we will look at a number of different examples of poetry and literature, probably starting with the great poet of the 14th century, Petrarch. So I've argued that the Renaissance begins in Florence, begins in northern Italy, in Tuscany, and then kind of spreads out and goes to different places. Eventually, that spirit of the Renaissance will penetrate northern Europe, places like Bruges and Flanders, and what is today Belgium and France, and what is today Germany, all the way to England, and then eventually Eastern Europe as well. But when the Renaissance goes from place to place, when the Renaissance goes from Italy to Northern Europe, it takes on a different kind of flavor. So there is absolutely a Northern Renaissance, which we can contrast to the Italian Renaissance. And that should be a lot of fun as well. One of my favorite things to do when I'm traveling around Europe is to go to the different museum collections and try to find pieces of art from these different periods. So I'm hoping that you will take the journey with me and we can check out some of the museums and collections in Florence and Padua, but also Rome and Venice, which is a super cool city as well. If you know anything about art, and I know a lot of you do, we're looking at an old palace in Paris called the Louvre. And the main entrance, but not the only entrance to the Louvre, is through an American architect named I.M. Pei's giant glass pyramid. And there is a wonderful collection of Renaissance art in the Louvre that we can take a look at. I suppose the most important Renaissance artwork by the most important Renaissance artist is at the Louvre. So we'll have to stop by. And because church art is so important, we can also take a look at some of the things in Avignon, France as well. And when we go north and take a look at the Northern Renaissance, we'll have to make a stop and see some of the Flemish primitives in Bruges, as well as Antwerp and Rotterdam. But look, any place you want to go, just let me know. Because classicism is such an important feature and it's such an important cultural value of the Renaissance, we have to start in antiquity. So we're going to look at just a few examples of ancient art, Greek sculpture, Greek architects, and Greek architecture that when it's rediscovered or revalued starting in the 13th century, these Renaissance artists copy. So we'll spend a little bit of time in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and I hope that you enjoy that. And then we'll take a look at some of the art of the late Middle Ages. The difficult thing about the Renaissance is going beyond the simple understanding, which is Rome was a great civilization, Renaissance Europe was a great civilization, in between nothing. Because of course that's not true. There are wonderful examples of art and sculpture and jewelry making and tapestry all over Europe during what occasionally we've called the Dark Ages. On the left there is Notre Dame de Paris on the Ile de la Cité in Paris, and on the right is the Bayeux Tapestry. So civilizations that can produce art like this isn't your 1,000 years without a bath. So we're going to have to unpack and maybe deconflict some of the art of the late Middle Ages as well, if for no other reason than to show a contrast between this art and the art of the Renaissance. And I think you'll enjoy that as well. So the last thing that we will do in this course is look at the legacy of the Renaissance. How did the Renaissance influence future cultural, political, economic movements? So, there is no real start date for the Renaissance as a cultural movement. If any historian who throws out a date is immediately going to be set on by other historians who say, well, that's not the date. It should be after, or it should be before. So the date that I like to use is the birth of Petrarch. So I like to use the first decade in the 14th century. But you could just as easily argue that it was Dante. You could just as easily argue that it was, 60 or 70 years in the future. But this thing does happen. And it influences things like the Protestant Reformation. You can draw a direct line from Erasmus writing his great treatise, or In Praise of Folly, or you could draw a direct line from Sir Thomas More's Utopia to Martin Luther in 1517, pinning the 95 Thesis to the church door in Wittenberg. The Age of Enlightenment, which changes the way we look at the world fundamentally, is a direct result of the skepticism and humanism with which we associate the Renaissance. When the period of Renaissance art ends, when we finish the high period of the Renaissance art, when we get past the Mannerists, the Baroque period is a direct reaction to Mannerism. The Romantic era, now we're in the 19th century, and the late 18th century. The Romantic era of art and literature, directly influenced by the Renaissance. And even if you get into the age of Impressionism and Expressionism and abstract Expressionism, and all of this is, you could sometimes not draw a direct line, but take a cubist like Picasso. Picasso doesn't happen without Cézanne. They said Cézanne is the father of us all. Well, Cézanne doesn't happen without the naturalism with which we associate Leonardo da Vinci. So it all starts with the Renaissance. So thank you for taking this journey with me. If you need me for any reason while we're doing this, if you want to reach out to me individually, this is my contact information. Please make use of it. I'm always happy to hear from students. And the next video that we're going to do will start not in 1306, but it will start significantly further back than that. So I'm looking forward to this class. I think it'll be a lot of fun, and I hope that you do too. Thank you.